The stars stretched endlessly beyond the observation deck of the Defiant, and Captain Jake Morrison stood watching them with his arms crossed behind his back. He had been stationed at the outer rim of human space for 2 years now, and every day felt the same until today. His second officer, Commander Lisa Warren, approached him with a data pad in her hand and worry written across her face. She handed him the device without saying a word because she knew he needed to read it himself. The message was from Council Prime, and it carried the official seal of the Galactic Council. Jake read through the document twice because he could not believe what he was seeing the first time. The Council had called an emergency session, and they were summoning Ambassador Helen Carter to answer charges against humanity. The charges made no sense to him. Humanity was accused of being too aggressive, too militaristic, and too dangerous to remain part of the civilized galaxy. Lisa stood beside him and waited for his response. Jake finally looked up and shook his head. They had protected Council worlds from pirates, honored every treaty, and asked for nothing in return except fair treatment. Now this Ambassador Helen Carter stood in the Grand Chamber of Council Prime 3 days later. The room was massive, with seats arranged in a circle rising up toward a domed ceiling that showed the stars beyond. Representatives from 47 different species sat in judgment, and most of them would not meet her eyes. At the center of it all sat Ambassador Krell of the Zenthari, his long fingers steepled together and his expression cold. He had never liked humans from the first moment they joined the Council. Helen began her defense with calm determination. She reminded the Council of every mission humanity had completed, every world they had defended, and every treaty they had honored without fail. She pointed out that human military expansion was purely defensive, and that Earth had never started a conflict with any Council species. Her voice rang clear through the chamber as she spoke of the 3 Council worlds that would have fallen to pirates, if not for human intervention, just 6 months ago. The Vernian representative looked away. They had been one of those worlds. Krell rose to respond, and his voice was smooth like oil on water. He spoke of humanity's rapid advancement and called it unnatural. He mentioned their weapons development and labeled it threatening. He suggested that a species so young and so violent could not be trusted among the peaceful civilized races of the galaxy. Other voices joined his. Species that had never spoken to a human before suddenly had strong opinions about Earth's intentions. Helen felt her heart sinking as she realized the decision had been made before she ever arrived. The vote came swiftly. 47 species voted to banish humanity from galactic space. Only 3 voted against it. Small species with no power who would be forgotten by the others before the session ended. Helen stood silent as Krell read the terms. All human colonies beyond the Sol system had to be evacuated within 6 months. Every trade agreement was terminated immediately. Earth's fleet had to retreat behind a barrier that would be erected at the edge of their space. No human vessel would be permitted to cross it. Admiral Patrick Hayes received the transmission in his office on Mars. He was a tall man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. When the message finished playing, he sat in silence for a full minute. Then he activated his communication array and sent orders to every human ship in the galaxy. They were coming home. All of them. But they were not going to leave empty-handed. Captain Jake Morrison ordered his crew to begin detailed scans of every Council military installation within range. Commander Lisa Warren coordinated with intelligence officers on other ships to compile data about trade routes, political alliances, and military capabilities. If humanity was being cast out, then they would know everything about those who cast them out. Knowledge would be their shield in the isolation to come. The evacuation took 5 months and 17 days. Human colonies on distant worlds packed their lives into cargo ships and said goodbye to homes they had built with their own hands. Trade stations went dark as the last human workers departed. Research outposts transmitted their final data and shut down their equipment. Every ship that could fly made the journey back to Sol system. Lisa stood on the bridge of the Defiant as they approached the boundary line. Behind them came the last struggling convoy of civilian vessels. Families who had lived their entire lives beyond Earth, now heading to a world many had never seen. Ahead of them, the emptiness of space waited. Jake gave the order and the Defiant crossed the line. One by one, every human ship followed. The barrier activated 6 hours later. It appeared as a shimmering wall of energy stretching across space in every direction. Sensors could not penetrate it and communications could not cross it. Jake watched it spring to life and felt something hard settle in his chest. The galaxy had rejected them. Fine. Humanity would survive without the galaxy. Admiral Hayes stood in the command center on Mars and watched the last ship cross to safety. The barrier sealed behind them like a door slamming shut. He looked at the officers around him and saw the same expression on every face. Anger, determination, and something else. A promise. They had been cast out for being too dangerous and too advanced. The Council had no idea how right they were. Now humanity had all the time in the world to show them exactly what humans could do when left alone. Helen Carter returned to Earth and resigned her position. She had spent 3 decades in diplomatic service, and it had ended with this betrayal. She moved to a small house in Colorado and tried to forget the faces of those who had voted to banish her entire species. But she could not forget. None of them could. The barrier stood at the edge of their system like a wall of shame. Beyond it, the galaxy continued without them. But walls work both ways. They keep you in, but they also keep others out. And behind that wall, humanity began to work. 5 years passed behind the barrier, and humanity changed in ways the Council could never have imagined. Captain Jake Morrison was now Admiral Morrison, and he stood in the Mars shipyards watching the construction of vessels that would have seemed impossible just years before. The ships taking shape in the construction bays were sleek and deadly, built with technology that no Council species possessed. Without access to their markets or their knowledge, humanity had been forced to create everything from scratch. Necessity had driven innovation faster than anyone expected. Dr. Nicole Palmer ran the Advanced Weapons Research Division at Europa Station. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a mind that never stopped working. Her team had achieved what Council scientists said was impossible. The quantum displacement drive sat in her laboratory, a device the size of a small room that could move a ship across distances that would take Council vessels weeks to cross. The drive bent space itself, creating a bubble that slipped through reality like a needle through fabric. Test results showed it was 10 times faster than anything the Council used. The first prototype ship equipped with the drive was called the Swift, and its test pilot was Commander Greg Sullivan. He was young for his rank, but had earned it through skill rather than time served. When he engaged the quantum drive for the first time, the ship vanished from Mars orbit and reappeared near Jupiter in under 3 minutes. The distance should have taken hours with conventional drives. Greg sat in the pilot seat and smiled. The Council had no idea what was coming. Greg's next assignment was testing the stealth frigate called the Shadow. The ship was covered in a special hull coating that absorbed sensor sweeps and scattered them into meaningless noise. Combined with a new engine design that produced almost no detectable emissions, the Shadow could slip through space like a ghost. Greg took the ship on a test run past the Sol defense perimeter, and the automated sensor nets never detected him once. He flew within 1,000 meters of a patrol ship, and they had no idea he was there. On Earth, Director Ryan Cooper coordinated the construction of the Sentinel Defense Network. Ryan was a quiet man who preferred systems to people, and he had designed a defense grid that would make any attacking force regret crossing into Sol space. Automated platforms positioned throughout the system carried weapons that would horrify the Council's peacekeeping committees. Railguns that could accelerate projectiles to a quarter of light speed, energy cannons that channeled contained solar plasma into focused beams, missile batteries with warheads that could crack a moon. But beyond the barrier, the galaxy was changing too. News feeds that occasionally slipped through the energy wall brought stories that made even isolated humanity pay attention. The Horgath Dominion had emerged from the galactic core, and they were nothing like the peaceful Council species. The Horgath conquered, they did not negotiate. They took what they wanted and destroyed what resisted. Their fleets moved through Council space like a plague. Admiral Morrison watched these reports in his office and saw the pattern forming. The Council had banished humanity for being too militaristic, but now they faced a real military power and had no idea how to respond. The same species that voted against human aggression were watching their colonies burn. The Xanthari had lost 4 worlds in 2 months. Their defensive fleets had been swept aside like dust. Lisa Warren, now Morrison's chief of staff, compiled intelligence reports about the Horgath advance. The numbers were staggering. Entire species had been subjugated. Trillions of beings were dead or enslaved. The Council's combined fleets had engaged the Horgath in a dozen major battles and lost every single one. Their ships were designed for patrol and peacekeeping, not war. The Horgath ships were built for nothing but war. On the Vernian homeworld, civilians fled from advancing Horgath troops. The same leaders who had voted to banish humanity now scrambled to mount any defense at all. Their weapons were outdated, their tactics were non-existent, and their soldiers had never faced a real enemy. The Vernian military collapsed in 3 weeks. Their government broadcast surrender terms and begged for mercy. The Horgath gave them none. Dr. Palmer worked 18-hour days in her laboratory. She knew that eventually the Horgath would reach human space. The barrier would not stop them forever. So she pushed her team harder, developed weapons that were more powerful, and created defenses that were stronger. Her latest project was something she called the Helios Cannon. It used magnetic fields to contain a small portion of stellar plasma, and then released it in a controlled beam. The test firing had vaporized an abandoned asteroid in seconds. The power consumption was enormous, but the results spoke for themselves. Greg Sullivan trained pilots in the new stealth tactics. The old Council doctrine of formation flying and direct engagement was useless with ships that could appear and disappear at will. Greg developed hit-and-run strategies, ambush techniques, and coordination methods that turned small squadrons into devastating strike forces. His pilots learned to think like predators, not like police. Helen Carter watched the news from her home in Colorado. She saw the species that had condemned humanity now facing their own extinction. Part of her felt vindicated, but most of her just felt sad. She had spent her life trying to build bridges between species, and it had ended with walls. She wondered if the Council ever thought about their decision. If they ever regretted casting out the one species that might have been able to help them. The Council sent no messages to Earth. Pride kept them silent even as their civilization crumbled. They had made their choice, and now they would live with it. Or die with it. Admiral Hayes monitored the situation and made plans. He did not trust the Council, but he trusted his own analysis. The Horgath would eventually push toward Sol System. When they did, humanity would be ready. Ryan Cooper completed the final platform in the Sentinel network. The grid now covered every approach to the inner system. Any hostile fleet would have to fight through 1,000 automated weapons platforms before they ever reached Earth. And behind those platforms waited Morrison's fleet, ships that could move faster, strike harder, and vanish more completely than anything the galaxy had seen. Lisa looked at the star maps in the command center and traced the Horgath advance. They were methodical, crushing resistance in one sector before moving to the next. At their current pace, they would control half the galaxy within 2 years. The Council was losing, and they were losing badly. She wondered how long their pride would last. How many worlds would have to fall before they swallowed it and asked for help? The barrier still stood at the edge of Sol space, a wall of energy that separated humanity from the galaxy. But behind that wall, humanity had not been idle. They had built, innovated, and prepared. The Council had wanted them gone because they were too dangerous. Now they were about to find out just how dangerous humanity could be when given time to prepare. The barrier flickered one morning, and alarms sounded throughout the Sol defense network. A single ship appeared at the edge of human space, badly damaged and leaking atmosphere. Admiral Morrison was in his office when the alert came through, and he immediately ordered the ship to be scanned. The vessel was Council-designed Xanthari construction, and it was dying. He granted permission for it to approach under strict supervision. The ship limped toward Mars on failing engines. Greg Sullivan took the Shadow out to escort it in, his weapons armed and ready in case this was some kind of trick. But as he got closer, he could see the damage was real. Burn marks covered the hull, entire sections were missing, and life support was running on emergency power. Whatever had hit this ship had hit it hard. The ship docked at Mars Station, and security teams met it with weapons ready. Only one passenger emerged, a Xanthari diplomat who looked nothing like the arrogant Council members humanity remembered. This one was young. His robes were torn and dirty, and his eyes held desperation rather than pride. He identified himself as Ambassador Vrel, son of Krell, and he carried a message from what remained of the Galactic Council. Admiral Morrison met with Vrel in a conference room with reinforced walls and armed guards outside. Lisa Warren stood at Morrison's right side, her hand resting near her sidearm. Captain Stephanie Miller, Morrison's tactical officer, sat across the table with her arms crossed and her expression cold. Vrel looked at them all and seemed to understand that he was not among friends. Vrel spoke for 20 minutes without interruption. He described the Horgoth advance in detail, numbers and dates and casualties that made the scope of the disaster clear. 40% of Council space was now under Horgoth control. Trillions were dead or enslaved. The Council's combined fleets had been shattered in battle after battle. Every defensive line had failed. Every stand had been broken. They were losing the war, and they were losing it badly. Stephanie could not stay quiet any longer. She leaned forward and asked why Earth should care about the Council's problems. They had cast humanity out like criminals, cut them off from the galaxy, and left them to die behind a barrier. Now they came begging for help, because their own weakness had caught up with them. Her voice was sharp enough to cut, and Vrel flinched from it. Vrel had no good answer. He admitted that the Council had been wrong, that they had acted out of fear and pride, and that they had made a terrible mistake. But the past could not be changed, only the future. The Horgoth would not stop with Council space. Once they finished conquering the known galaxy, they would turn their attention to the unknown. Sol System would be next. Humanity's isolation would not protect them forever. Morrison listened without expression. He asked what exactly the Council was requesting. Vrel's answer was simple. Everything. They wanted Admiral Morrison's fleet, Dr. Palmer's weapons, Commander Sullivan's stealth technology, and every advantage humanity had developed. In return, they offered full reinstatement into the Council, trade agreements, territorial concessions, and promises of eternal friendship. Morrison dismissed Vrel and told him to wait while Earth considered the request. The Zenthari was given quarters under guard, and Morrison convened his senior staff. Lisa, Stephanie, and Lieutenant Ben Torres, the intelligence chief, gathered in the secure conference room. The debate that followed was heated. Lisa argued for caution. The Council had betrayed them once and would likely do so again. They could not be trusted with human technology or relied upon to honor any agreement. Stephanie agreed and suggested letting the Council fall. Let them reap what they had sown. Ben presented a different perspective based on intelligence analysis. The Horgoth would eventually reach Sol System whether humanity helped or not. It was only a matter of time. Better to fight them now with allies, even unreliable ones, than later alone. Morrison sat and listened to all of them. He valued their opinions and respected their reasoning. But the final decision was his to make. He thought about the trillions of civilians dying in Horgoth labor camps. He thought about entire species being erased from existence. He thought about what humanity stood for and what kind of people they wanted to be. The Council did not deserve help, but the innocent civilians suffering under Horgoth rule deserved a chance. He made his decision. He would take the proposal to the United Earth government, but he already knew what he would recommend. Not because the Council had earned it, but because humanity refused to let innocent people die when they had the power to prevent it. Lisa shook her head but accepted the decision. Stephanie looked angry but said nothing. Ben nodded in agreement. Helen Carter was brought out of retirement to negotiate terms. She had spent 5 years trying to forget the Council, and now she had to deal with them again. But she was the best diplomat humanity had, and this was too important to let personal feelings interfere. She met with Vrel and laid out Earth's conditions in clear terms. The agreement would include permanent safeguards against future banishment. Any attempt to isolate humanity again would be considered an act of war. Human representatives would hold positions in Council leadership with veto power over military decisions. Earth would receive full access to all Council scientific databases, historical records, and cultural archives. Human colonies could be established anywhere with no restrictions. Trade would be conducted on terms favorable to Earth. Vrel agreed to everything without hesitation. The Council had no leverage and no options. They were desperate, and Helen made sure they paid the full price for that desperation. She felt no guilt about it. They had cast humanity out without mercy, and now they would welcome them back without dignity. Admiral Morrison began mobilizing the fleet. 200 capital ships received orders to prepare for combat operations. 500 stealth frigates underwent final system checks. Dr. Palmer loaded the Helios cannon prototypes onto the science vessel Discovery. Greg Sullivan briefed his pilots on tactics for fighting an enemy they had never seen. Ryan Cooper updated the Sentinel network to defend Earth in the fleet's absence. The barrier came down 6 weeks after Vrel's arrival. The energy wall that had separated humanity from the galaxy for 5 years simply vanished. Beyond it lay a galaxy at war, civilizations crumbling, and an enemy that had never faced humans in battle. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiant and gave the order. The fleet moved out. What emerged from soul space stunned the Council observers who had gathered to witness humanity's return. Ship after ship passed through where the barrier had been, each one larger and more advanced than anything the Council had ever built. The designs were alien, the weapons were terrifying, and the fleet moved with a precision that spoke of extensive training. Lisa stood beside Morrison and watched the stars ahead. They were going back to the galaxy that had rejected them, not as beggars or supplicants but as saviors. The Council would learn what humanity had become in isolation. The Horgath would learn what humanity could do in war, and the galaxy would learn that casting out humans had been the Council's greatest mistake. The human fleet emerged from Sol space, and the Council observers could not believe what they were seeing. 200 capital ships led by the Defiant moved in perfect formation, each vessel twice the size it had been 5 years ago. Energy shields shimmered around their hulls with a blue glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Weapons arrays bristled from every angle, designs the Council had never encountered. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge and felt a cold satisfaction. Let them see what humanity had built. Behind the capital ships came 500 frigates that suddenly vanished from every sensor. Council military advisors watching the fleet stared at their displays in confusion. The ships had been there one moment and gone the next, not destroyed but simply invisible. Captain Greg Sullivan commanded the stealth carrier Phantom, and his pilots flew the ghost ships that could not be detected. He coordinated the reconnaissance wing from his command center, watching as his squadron spread out across space like invisible hands. Dr. Nicole Palmer joined the fleet aboard the science vessel Discovery. The ship's cargo holds contained prototypes of weapon systems that had never been tested in real combat. Her crown jewel was the Helios cannon, a massive device that required half the ship's power output to fire. The weapon channeled stellar plasma through magnetic containment fields and released it in a beam that could cut through anything. During tests, it had melted asteroids into vapor. Against enemy ships, Palmer expected similar results. The first engagement came at the Vrick system where a Horgath battle group had surrounded the last Council stronghold. 30 Horgath heavy cruisers and over 100 support vessels formed a blockade around the planet. They had been bombarding the surface for days, and the Council defenders were close to collapse. Captain Stephanie Miller commanded the assault carrier Valkyrie, and Morrison gave her the honor of leading the strike. Stephanie did not announce their arrival or demand surrender. The human fleet simply appeared at optimal firing range with their stealth systems disengaging all at once. The Horgath fleet turned to face this new threat, and Stephanie gave the order to fire. The battle did not last long enough to be called a fight. It was an execution. The railguns fired first. Projectiles accelerated to a quarter of light speed crossed the distance in seconds. 3 Horgath cruisers exploded before their shields even activated, the kinetic impact turning them into expanding clouds of debris. The Horgath formation broke apart as captains tried to respond to an attack they did not understand. Their weapons were designed for close-range combat, but the humans were fighting from a distance that made their guns useless. The Helios cannon fired for the first time in combat. Dr. Palmer watched from the Discovery as the weapons' containment fields aligned and released their payload. A beam of white-hot plasma crossed space and struck a Horgath command carrier in the center. The ship's armor meant nothing against temperatures that matched the surface of a star. Metal vaporized, systems melted, and the carrier came apart in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire battlefield. Greg Sullivan's stealth frigates danced through the chaos. They appeared behind enemy ships, fired their torpedoes, and vanished before return fire could be aimed. Each torpedo was guided by advanced targeting systems that tracked engine signatures and locked onto the weakest points of enemy hulls. Horgath ships exploded one after another as torpedoes found their reactor cores. The enemy fleet tried to run, but they had nowhere to go. 20 minutes after it began, the battle was over. The Horgath fleet was reduced to wreckage and escape pods. Human casualties were 0. 2 frigates reported minor damage from debris impacts, nothing that required dry dock. Morrison watched the tactical display and felt no joy in the victory. This was just the first battle of many to come. Lieutenant Commander Amy Foster handled communications for the fleet. She was young but competent, and Morrison trusted her to speak for humanity. She broadcast a message on all frequencies in every language the Council used. The words were simple. Earth remembers. Earth protects. Earth has returned. The message reached the Council observers on the planet below, and they transmitted it to Council Prime. Within hours, the entire galaxy knew that humanity was back. The battles that followed formed a pattern. Horgath fleets outnumbered human forces 10 to 1, 20 to 1, sometimes more. The numbers did not matter. Human technology and tactics proved overwhelmingly superior. Quantum drives let them appear anywhere they wanted. Stealth systems let them strike without warning. Weapons hit harder and faster than anything the Horgath had encountered. Every engagement ended the same way, with Horgath ships burning and human ships untouched. Captain Ben Torres commanded the intelligence ship Oracle. The vessel looked like a simple frigate, but carried the most advanced sensor and communication arrays humanity had built. Ben coordinated information warfare that crippled Horgath command and control across multiple sectors. Every transmission they sent was intercepted. Every order was decoded. Every movement was tracked. The Horgath could not communicate without humans listening. They could not plan without humans knowing their intentions hours before they acted. Admiral Morrison pushed the fleet hard. They jumped from system to system, relieving besieged Council worlds and destroying Horgath forces wherever they found them. The campaign had no pause and no mercy. Lisa coordinated logistics to keep the fleet supplied and functional. Stephanie led assault after assault with precision that left no room for error. Greg's stealth wings eliminated enemy commanders and destroyed supply depots. Dr. Palmer's weapons turned fortified positions into craters. The Council worlds they liberated greeted them with celebrations and tears. Species that had voted to banish humanity now cheered for human soldiers. Cities named streets after Morrison and his captains. Monuments were erected to honor Earth's intervention. Morrison accepted none of it personally. He ordered his crews to remain professional and distant. They were not here to make friends. They were here to do a job. The Horgath began to adapt. They spread their fleets out to avoid concentrated human attacks. They developed new tactics to counter stealth ships. They reinforced their formations and improved their communications security. Ben watched the changes and reported them to Morrison. The enemy was learning, but they were learning too slowly. By the time they adapted to one human tactic, Morrison had moved on to 3 others. At the Battle of Nexus Prime, the Horgath made their stand. They gathered their main armada, 2,000 vessels representing every ship they could pull from occupied territories. This was their full strength committed to one decisive battle. Morrison received the intelligence and made his decision. He would meet them with everything he had. 200 human ships against 2,000 Horgath vessels. The odds did not concern him. The battle lasted 6 hours. Dr. Palmer's quantum drives allowed the human fleet to appear exactly where they were needed. They struck at weak points, eliminated command ships, and vanished before the enemy could respond. Greg's stealth wings killed Horgath flagships in the opening minutes, leaving their formations leaderless and confused. Stephanie's assault groups hammered their capital ships with concentrated fire. Lisa coordinated the entire fleet like pieces on a chessboard, moving ships into position and pulling them out before they could be trapped. The Horgath fought desperately. They knew this was their last chance to stop humanity. Their ships rammed human vessels when weapons failed. Their captains ordered suicidal charges that accomplished nothing. Their empire was built on conquest and intimidation, but they had never faced an enemy that was simply better than them in every way. When the battle ended, the Horgath Dominion's military power was broken. Over 1,500 ships were destroyed. The survivors fled back to their core territories. Morrison did not pursue. He had made his point. The Horgath Emperor sued for peace within days, agreeing to release every conquered world and withdraw all forces from Council space. The war was over. The Galactic Council held a grand ceremony on Council Prime to celebrate the victory and officially welcome humanity back into the fold. The same chamber where Ambassador Helen Carter had been condemned now prepared to honor her species as saviors. Dignitaries from every council species filled the seats, their robes and ceremonial dress creating a rainbow of colors. At the center of it all stood a podium where speeches would be made and treaties would be signed. Admiral Morrison attended in his full-dress uniform. The dark blue fabric was crisp and clean, medals arranged across his chest in perfect rows. Lisa Warren stood at his right shoulder, also in dress uniform. Captain Stephanie Miller was at his left. Behind them stood the captains and commanders who had led the fleet to victory. Greg Sullivan, Ben Torres, Amy Foster, and dozens more. They had been invited as heroes and they came as professionals. Ambassador Vrel of the Zenthari opened the ceremony. He stood at the podium and spoke of humanity's courage and strength. He offered a formal apology on behalf of his people for the banishment 5 years ago. His father Krell had died during the war, killed when Horgath forces overran a Zenthari colony. Vrel was different from his father, humbled by war and desperate to make amends. His words sounded sincere, but Morrison remained unmoved. Words were easy, actions mattered. Other species added their voices to the chorus of gratitude. The Vernian representative spoke of human soldiers defending their homeworld when their own military had collapsed. The Telrathi honored the human pilots who had saved their evacuation fleet from destruction. The Korvax praised human engineers who had rebuilt their orbital defenses. Every species had a story of human intervention, human sacrifice, and human victory. The cheers were loud when Morrison was called to the podium. Thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds applauded as he walked forward. He did not smile or wave. He simply stood at the podium and waited for the noise to die down. When silence finally fell, he began to speak in a voice that carried through the chamber without amplification. Morrison thanked the council for their recognition, but made it clear that humanity had not fought for gratitude. They fought because innocent lives were at stake and because standing by while others suffered was not in their nature. He reminded the assembled species that Earth had been cast out once and had survived that rejection. They had built a fleet, developed technology, and created a defense network without council help or council approval. Humanity had proven they did not need the council, but the council had learned they needed humanity. The chamber grew quiet as his words sank in. Morrison continued without mercy. He spoke of the casual cruelty with which the council had banished an entire species. He mentioned the votes cast without hesitation, the treaties broken without remorse, and the barrier erected without apology. He reminded them that humanity had honored every agreement, while the council had honored none. The faces in the audience showed shame, anger, and discomfort. Good. They should be uncomfortable. Helen Carter watched from her seat and felt pride surge through her. This was the speech she would have given 5 years ago if she had been allowed. Morrison was not diplomatic or gentle. He was honest, and sometimes honesty cut deeper than any weapon. The truth was that the council had failed in every way that mattered. They had failed to be just, failed to be wise, and failed to protect their own people. Only human intervention had saved them from complete destruction. The treaty that followed established new terms for human participation in galactic affairs. Earth would not be a member species subject to council authority. Instead, humanity became a permanent protectorate power with independent status. 3 permanent seats on the council's ruling body with veto power over any military action. Full access to all scientific databases, cultural archives, and historical records. Freedom to establish colonies anywhere without restriction or approval. Trade agreements that favored human interests. Military alliance only on terms that Earth found acceptable. The council agreed to everything because they had no choice. Their military power was broken, their economies were ruined, and their populations were traumatized. They needed human protection and human technology to rebuild. The balance of power had shifted completely, and everyone in the chamber understood it. Humanity was no longer the junior species begging for acceptance. They were the dominant force in the galaxy, whether anyone liked it or not. Morrison signed the treaty with a pen that Helen had given him. The same pen she had used to sign the original membership agreement 30 years ago. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber without waiting to be dismissed. His officers followed him in perfect formation. The council representatives watched them go and seemed unsure whether they had just witnessed a triumph or a humiliation. Perhaps it was both. As they left the building, Stephanie spoke quietly to Greg. She asked how long it would take before the council resented humanity for being their saviors. Greg smiled without humor and said some already did. But it did not matter. Humanity had not done this for council gratitude. They had done it because it was right, because innocent people needed help, and because walking away would have meant abandoning their values. Back in Sol System, construction continued on the next generation of warships. Dr. Palmer's team was already working on improvements to the quantum drive that would make ships even faster. The Helios cannon design was being refined to reduce power consumption while increasing range. New weapon systems were in development that pushed the boundaries of what physics allowed. The Sentinel Defense Network expanded with additional platforms, and more advanced targeting systems. Ryan Cooper coordinated the expansion from his office on Earth. He never stopped planning for threats that might come. The Horgath were defeated but not destroyed. Other empires existed beyond explored space. Unknown dangers lurked in the dark between stars. Humanity had learned the most important lesson of all: never depend on others for protection and never be caught unprepared. They would be ready for whatever came next. Admiral Morrison returned to Mars and resumed command of the fleet. He had no interest in politics or ceremony. His job was defending humanity, and he would do that job until he could not anymore. Lisa handled the endless stream of council requests for assistance, trade negotiations, and diplomatic meetings. Most of them she rejected. Earth would help on their terms or not at all. The galaxy settled into an uneasy peace. Council species rebuilt their worlds with human assistance but also with human oversight. Human officers advised their militaries. Human engineers improved their defenses. Human diplomats sat in their governments. Some welcomed the help. Others resented the intrusion. Morrison did not care about their feelings. His responsibility was to humanity first and everyone else second. Greg trained new pilots in stealth tactics and advanced combat maneuvers. The next generation of human military would be even better than the current one. Ben expanded the intelligence network to monitor threats across the entire galaxy. Amy established communication protocols that would let human forces coordinate across vast distances. Every captain and commander who had fought in the war now worked to ensure the next war would end just as decisively. Helen Carter stayed retired in her Colorado home. She had done her part by negotiating the treaty. Now it was time for others to carry the burden. She watched the news feeds and saw humanity's influence spreading through council space. Human culture, human technology, and human values were changing the galaxy, whether the galaxy wanted to change or not. Perhaps that was fitting. The council had tried to isolate humanity, and instead had created something far more powerful than they could have imagined. The barrier that had once separated Sol system from the galaxy was gone. But humanity had not forgotten the isolation or the betrayal. That memory would stay with them for generations. Trust had to be earned, and the council had a long way to go before they earned human trust again. Until then, humanity would protect the galaxy not as friends but as guardians. Distant, powerful, and utterly unwilling to be pushed around ever again. The stars stretched endlessly in every direction, full of species and civilizations that now looked to Earth for protection. Admiral Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Defiant and watched those stars with the same expression he always wore. Calm, focused, and ready. The galaxy was safer with humans in it, whether anyone appreciated that truth or not. And if another threat emerged, if another empire sought to conquer, if another danger arose, Earth's fleet would be there, because that was what humanity did. They survived, they adapted, and they protected those who could not protect themselves, even those who had once cast them aside.